Hello and welcome to the Marana Business Community Podcast, presented by the Marana Chamber of Commerce. In this space, we feature local business leaders making a difference in the Marana community. They share information about their business, what makes them successful, what they have learned, and tips to help you in your business or daily life. I'm Amanda Wiggins, your host for today's podcast. Welcome, and we're excited to have George Kennedy on the podcast, the Marana Business Community Podcast, with us today. Welcome, George.
Thank you. Good morning. Delighted to be here.
Good morning. So George is our Marana Chamber of Commerce chair of the Economic Development Council, but he has so much more. That's how I've quickly got to meet him in my time here. A retired senior Foreign Service officer and federal executive, his foreign service career took him to 7 countries and culminated in his appointment as Consul General in Toronto. He kept busy after retirement as a political advisor to several elected officials and advising small to medium-sized enterprises regarding opportunities in overseas markets. He's very active in the community, has served on advisory boards for the United Way of Tucson in Southern Arizona and the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Arizona. He is also active in his local community as an independent business owner. George is a writer, policy analyst, and teacher whose passions are politics, people, and revealing to others how to make choices that shape the direction of their lives. George, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So can you tell me, in addition to that brief introduction, who is George Kennedy?
Well, I think you've covered a lot of it, but generally when I'm asked that question, I suggest to people that they read my memoir, Cotton Fields to Summits, because I spend a great deal of time trying to define who this George Kennedy is. But for our purposes this morning, to keep it simple, I would just say that George Kennedy is the average American kid born back in the 1940s, possessed of rapacious curiosity, powered by a relentless imagination, who somehow felt he was destined to be something different and do something different. He just didn't know what. And that curiosity, that imagination led him to make a decision to consider the Foreign Service a career and ultimately to live an interesting and challenging life.
Can you tell us, did you always know you wanted to go into Foreign Service?
No, I didn't. That was by accident. And to make that long story very short, I was a young GI returning from a tour of duty in Italy back in 1962. And in those days, you were brought back on a troop ship, like there were 6,000 of us. And we found in Fort Hamilton, New York, in this cavernous building, and there were all these chairs with these large brown envelopes on them. So we were all excited, hot to trot. So we're standing there, and the officer who was supposed to discharge us was late. So we kept standing up, sitting down, and at some point I sat on this envelope. I looked at it, I put it back. Unconsciously, I put it in my travel bag. I go home, and a month later, I'm unpacking, and I find this envelope. So I go through it. And what it was just a series of notices about federal job opportunities for returning veterans. So I see something that says U.S. State Department. So I'm looking, and it says we're looking for people that have overseas experience. I check the box. Comfortable with foreign languages. I check the box. And then it said backgrounds in communications. I checked the box. So I thought, I got nothing to do. Why don't I apply? They're going to tell me no anyway. So I get out the old typewriter, the Form 57, the carbon paper, and I made an application. And I forgot all about it. 6 months later, I'm at a Christmas party hosted by one of my high school teachers. They called me. Kenny says, Ken, I want you to meet somebody. And this was a young guy. He was the only black guy he knew that had ever served in the State Department. He had one question. He said, where are you in the application process? And I said, well, the FBI has been through the community. I don't know. He said, "You've been hired, you just don't know it." I said, "No, I don't believe that." So again, I forgot all about it. 5 months later, I'm waiting for the letter that says thank you, but no thank you. That arrived. I said, "I knew it." So again, I'm job hunting, trying to find a way to settle down. So in June, another letter said, "How many times do they want to reject me?" One was enough. And this letter says, "We are pleased to offer you an appointment." You could have scraped me off the ceiling. And they assigned me to the embassy in Bonn. And that's how I joined the Foreign Service. Had that officer been on time, like a lot of other young guys, I would have left that envelope on that chair or dumped it in the barrel by the door. They were recycling many, many years ago. But that's how I heard about the Foreign Service, and that's how I wound up joining.
That's a great story, George. Thanks for sharing that. I bet that you have many during your time there. Is there any that pop up in your mind and might be a good example of what foreign service is for anyone who might not understand that?
Well, the Foreign Service, like any international organization, is very structured and is very complex. And in the early years, since I was still considering the Foreign Service, I was fortunate to become what they call a Foreign Service staff member. So you could take a step back and you could look at it and decide whether this is something you really wanted to do. And so your responsibilities were different. The people you interacted with on a daily basis were very different. And so I was free to pretty much roam and just deal with my curiosity and make some early decisions. And I thought this could be an interesting career because in the early days, you didn't see people who looked like me. The embassy at that time was the largest in the world, and I was the only African American there. But people treated me well, and I was back in Europe again at the age of 23. And so I could take a step back, and I saw what the responsibilities were for the officer. I decided, if I make this a career, then I think I want to become an officer. And then my focus shifted because then I really had to spend time with the questions, who is George Kennedy relative to international diplomacy? What is it that he feels he can accomplish? How does he think he can accomplish goals within this organization? But more importantly, why it is important to him that he do so. So I spent years just grappling with those questions, trying to determine where I wanted to position myself. And that was very helpful because a lot of the younger officers came right in with different responsibilities. Some of them, they did not like them. The attrition rate was high, but I had the luxury of distance and time to make those decisions.
Upon your retirement from the U.S. State Department, you were a political advisor and consultant to small and medium-sized enterprises. Can you share about how you got there and more of your time with that?
Two different threads there. On the political side, I've been a political junkie all of my life because politics is what I call human chess. It's about behavior. It's about positioning. It is about strategic advantage. And I've always been curious about those things. Again, looking at it from my vantage point, why do certain policies exist? Why do certain practices exist? And so I've always loved to write. And I had the opportunity to meet a lot of interesting political types in the Foreign Service. And I got involved in politics on the periphery very early on. And so when I retired, I met people like the former mayor of Atlanta, Maynard Jackson, who was considering a run for the Senate. And by then, people were asking me, well, George, what do you think? Can you help me out? And so I delighted in writing policy papers, position papers, strategic approaches they might take. And so I did that for a while. I did that with Senator Ted Kennedy. and a couple of other people that were considered making presidential. I just enjoyed it. And that's how I got involved with politics on that level. On the independent business side, I didn't consider that until I came to Tucson, because all of my life, all of my training, as you well know, our educational system tries to design you to become a good employee. It's just at different levels. And when I got out here, I met someone at a business breakfast at the Old Pueblo on Alvanon, I think it is. And through him, I was introduced to a number of people who invited me to a meeting. And there I heard this medical doctor talk about two things that intrigued me. He talked about financial literacy and financial independence. And that's not something we talk a lot about either in college or university or at home. And then he talked about leverage, individual leverage, and how to leverage your skills, your abilities, your time, your education. I thought, that's fascinating. And he told us how he did it. And I'm looking for a way to become involved in the community here. I think I joined the chamber by that time. And I thought, this might be a way for me to kind of give back, to get involved with people here, because as you well know, the economy in Marana and Tucson in 2005 left a lot to be desired. It was very weak. It wasn't very complex. People worked hard, they didn't work smart. So I thought, since I was financially stable, you might call it, I was just looking for a way that I could show people how to achieve what I had. And I thought the best way to do that could be by becoming independent. And I did that for about 10 years. I was successful. And I was able to build an organization that was worldwide. But more importantly, I was able to bring a number of people into my business that, as I said, knew how to work hard, but I knew that in their lifetimes they were never going to be financially independent. They just knew how to put in 50, 60 hours a week. But they didn't know how to leverage their skills and their abilities on their behalf rather than for their employer. And that's when I learned that there's a difference between being a W-2 employee and a 1099. Before that, I never considered. I've been a W-2 employee all my life.
What sparked that passion for mentoring and giving back, George? I imagine something in your life or a series of things.
It did. I discovered early on that in this journey called life, whether we acknowledge it or not, each of us has what I call a chorus of angels, those people who come into your life at strategic points, who offer advice or counsel or resources at a point when you think you've reached to the end of the road, and they can show you how it's just a bend in the road. And there were a number of people that had been there for me, that made the difference for me. And I always said that if I ever have the opportunity to give back in that sense, I would. And that's what inspired me to become a recruiter for the State Department, for several other agencies, for a university. And I've always been involved with young people, even when I was a much younger person. But I enjoy trying to help shape what I would call an emerging generation, identify who they are, where they want to go, because there were people there for me when I was trying to make those same decisions.
When you made that decision to become a Foreign Service officer, can you tell us what that was like? And then a little more about your time. I feel like I might have gotten away from that, but there's so much story there that would be incredible to hear. Where did you go and what did that look like?
Well, when I decided to become an officer, I left the Foreign Service and went back to school. And I was living in Manila at the time, and I was one of those small group of people who had begun to fear that we were going to lose the war in Vietnam. You didn't talk about it much, but I decided then that if I'm going to do this, I want greater responsibility. I want greater access. So I left the Foreign Service and I went back to school and I rejoined the Foreign Service later as an officer because at that point I knew how to position myself for the kind of responsibilities I wanted. And lo and behold, they sent me to the American Embassy in Rome. And I'm thinking, I've already lived in Italy 3 years. They're sending me back. I don't believe they're doing this. But anyhow, they sent me to Rome. And my responsibilities there had a great deal to do with trying to show American businessmen how to access the Italian export market. And I was mentored by one of the giants of the time, a gentleman who was considered Mr. Export for the Foreign Commercial Service and the State Department. And he, as we say, taught me the business. And from that point on, I decided that if I could work with economic diplomacy, then I would really enjoy being an officer because I'd gone back to school, I'd studied economics, I'd gotten a couple of graduate degrees in it, and this is what I thought I wanted to do. And I thought that I could best put those skills to use if I were to be assigned to what they would call a less developed country. And so I applied for Russia, I applied for posts in Africa thinking they couldn't get me there fast, and they sent me to South Korea. But it was great because at that time, South Korea was considered an emerging second world economy. And I got to learn a lot about how economies like South Korea and Brazil and India are structured and where there were opportunities for Americans to take advantage of those markets. And it just made for a much more fascinating career than issuing visas and things like that.
How did you transition to that independent business ownership from your time there?
Well, when I got out of the Foreign Service, I had some pretty good ideas about what I might do in my post-retirement life, because one of the things I had seen in the 70s and the 80s when the American corporations were looking at opportunities in overseas markets, a lot of trade missions would come through Europe, through countries like Italy. And one of the things I noticed was that inevitably those trade missions were all white men. I rarely saw a female among them, and I never saw a person of color throughout the 70s and the 80s. By the 1990s, that had begun to change. And this is when I discovered that female and minority-owned enterprises employed a large percentage of local community workforces in this country. And some of them were positioned by virtue of their structure, the service they offered, or their product, to look at those opportunities. And so a guy that I met at the Department of Commerce and I decided to form our own consultancy. And what we wanted to do was approach females and minority-owned CEOs to say, look national, look global. We have the expertise to show you how to position your company to move into those markets. Be careful what you wish for. Frustration, it was challenging, it was fun. We did that for about 4 years and then we moved on. But you learned a lot about just where people are in terms of how they view opportunity. Again, you found people that could put in 70, 80 hours a week, willing to work hard, but when you talked about how to structure a business or a company to compete in another culture, with another language, where there are different regulations, people weren't always willing to make that transition. And you became their kind of one-stop counselor for everything. And when you're on percentage time like that, you just couldn't do that. But that's how we got into that.
So, in addition to the many things we've discussed, you're an author of several books.
I am.
Can you share more about what that was like getting into writing? I know you've always been a writer, but deciding to be a published author, and a little bit about the books that you've written. You mentioned one earlier.
Well, the only book I ever really wanted to write was a memoir, because I remember as a kid growing up, I remember my great-grandparents, and we used to ask a lot of questions. And in those days, they would just shoo us away, go leave me alone. And so as I evolved into my career, I thought it would be fun to chronicle my journey in such a way so that 2 or 3 generations down the road, somebody might ask, well, who was Uncle Al and what did he do? So they could point to something and say, read that. And I always wanted to write the memoir, not for purposes of publishing, but just to leave something. I was living here in Arizona, and I used to work out in the morning at 5 o'clock with a group of guys at our fitness center. And one of the things we discovered we had in common was we all loved to write. And one of the guys asked, he says, George, do you write fiction? I said, well, life for me has never been about fiction. I don't read fiction. I wouldn't know how to begin to write fiction. He says, well, what have you got to lose? Why don't you try it? And somehow the question resonated. And because I've always had this great imagination, I got this idea. I said, well, okay, in 2008, what if, and I asked the question, if that individual's running mate had been female as opposed to someone else, what if he had not survived his presidency? What would history look like had we had our first female president in 2008? What were the challenges she would have confronted? And by that time, we may have had an African American as the first vice president. So I'm playing with this. And I conceived the idea to write a trilogy. Again, not for publication, just to accept the challenge. I had 2 friends that were avid fiction readers, and I said, look at this. Does it even make sense? I just want to see if I could do it. And they said, well, George, with a little bit of work, you may have something here. And so I just started writing, and I'm a very disciplined person anyhow. I'd get up at 3 o'clock. I would just write. And I finished the first manuscript. I just kept writing, and they would mark it up and send it back. I just kept writing, and they said, this is good. Really? So I published the first book, and they said, well, where's the rest of the story? So that got me into the second book and the third book. And they kept saying, but you haven't finished telling the story. So by the time I finished, I wrote 6 books in 4 years. And by this time, the brain is just in a fog. So I published the last of that 6-book series in May of this year. And I just took the summer off. But had that friend of mine not challenged me, the last thing I ever thought I would do at this phase of life is write fiction. And I've written 6 books of fiction. I just think that's cool.
I think, George, to get to the summits you have to be willing to take challenges and to dream, which,
Yes.
is yet happened. So I think that you are a perfect person to be a fiction writer.
Well, they called me the dreamer in the family, but I was always curious about everything beyond my immediate environment. And it was that imagination that led me to make some of the early decisions I did about how I could get back to school, what kind of career could be interesting. It was how I wound up joining the Army when it was the last thing on my mind. Just willing to look in different directions than the average individual from my immediate community. I was just fascinated by everything I didn't see and understand. So that's what took me in these different directions.
George, looking at your website and then hearing more of your story behind your book, Cotton Fields to Summits, it appears and it's evident your family is very important to you.
It
You
is.
have photos of them on your website
You
with
saw that?
descriptions. I saw that. Can you tell us more about your family and what that has been like for you and in the early part of your journey and today?
Well, I came from a highly supportive family, and I knew my great-grandparents, and they were part of that exodus that moved from the South in the early part of the last century that moved north. And I was always fascinated by the stories they would tell us about what life was like in South Carolina in the 1890s and the early part of the 20th century. And anyone that reads the book will read that chapter where my older brother and I went to South Carolina in 1948. And that's where my real education began, because we saw signs that didn't make sense. And we just didn't understand what they meant and why people had to be differentiated in that way. And so you come home and you ask all these questions. And my maternal grandmother was the kind of person, when you ask her a question, she'd give you an answer. And so that took me into the backgrounds of all of my cousins that were part of that great generation of the 20s and the 30s. And I discovered that they all had unfulfilled dreams. As they would say to me when I asked the question, well, why didn't you? They said, George, or some called me Alpha. They said, life happened. I didn't quite know what that meant. I was too young at the time. But they all felt, and they said this later, that I was different. And I think they all invested something in me. And I always felt that I had this obligation, that whatever my life was going to mean, I had a debt that I had to pay, that I would willingly pay, because I was the one that somehow was able to get out, to escape. And they were always there for me. And I never forgot that.
That's incredible, George. It's such a telling bit of who you are and what I've seen in our short time knowing each other. So that leads me to my favorite question. Because you're here, why did you choose Marana,
Oh, wow.
Arizona?
Well, shortly after I retired, I was in touch with a former Foreign Service colleague I met in Manila back in the mid-'60s. And she was living here in Marana. In fact, she was one of the first residents in Heritage Highlands. And she knew I was considering the possibility of retiring either in Reno because of my favorite uncle or in California because of my younger brother. But she says, George, why don't you come to Marana? I said, what is that? Where is it? So I was reading a publication at the time called Where to Retire. And they would do this graph. They would put some of the major metropolitan areas on one graph, and then they would put some of the preferred retirement sites like Arizona. And they said, all right, the way to evaluate whether this is a place to retire, they would give us a basket of goods and services and say what that would cost you in certain places. And I thought, Arizona, like 62 cents on a dollar. That's not bad. So I flew out here just to see what it was. My friend met me at the airport, took me up to Heritage Highlands. I went in, I said, I like it. I bought a house. And I went home and I made an announcement. And as I said earlier, I just got married and I wasn't used to this consultation thing. And my wife said, you did what? So I came out here and she took a look and she said, no way. And so gradually, on the second trip, she said, okay. Now you couldn't get her out of here if you wanted to, but one of the things I do when I move into any community, I try to get involved with the Chamber of Commerce, and I try to get involved with the local university. And through contacts I had made in the business community, I began to learn more about Marana and what I saw as its potential in the early years. And this is 2005 when, believe me, Marana looked very, very different but I could see it. And I think that came from just my Foreign Service experience. You just look at something and you see what can be as opposed to what is, and you juxtapose that with the people that have the responsibility for its leadership and trying to put together a vision for what they think this community could look like. And that's what captured me. And I still, to me, as I look at Marana, I see this huge welcome sign. I see a business-friendly ecosystem that says no matter what level of business enterprise you represent, here is a place you can invest. Here you can depend upon the leadership, the vision, the potential. This is a place where there is room for individuals and families become part of any community engagement. This is a place that says it's safe. You can come here and you can build whatever future you want. And I've never felt that about any other community anywhere in this country. And that is what persuaded us to remain here. That's why we're still here to this day.
George, you mentioned that it looked a lot different, but you could see it. Yeah. I heard recently at a ribbon cutting celebration for the new Innovation High School that JTED has done in collaboration with Tucson Unified School District. They have one building there, and one of the speakers said, there's several buildings around here. You just can't see them yet.
And I can relate to that.
And I thought that resonated with you as well. Can you speak a little bit more for what you can see here in Marana that's maybe not here yet?
Well, with the right investments in infrastructure, for example, I can see a business community between here in Twin Peaks and here in I-10 on Tangerine, for example, that I know is going to lead to some massive transportation issues, but I can see what I would call a preferred destination for a lot of companies that may be looking at the Southwest that begin to hear about the companies that are making a move in this direction, and they're wondering why, because many people don't know about Arizona, or what they do know does not speak, I think, adequately to what Arizona represents. And I can see a community here of 60, 65, 70,000 in 10 years and growing. I think the challenge for Marana is going to be how to structure that growth so that they don't make the mistakes that a lot of other new communities have made, that they have to somehow try to correct when it's too late. And I think with the right vision, the right plans, with active community engagement, they can create a diverse community that meets the needs of not only those that are here, but those that may be looking at Marana, not Tucson, but looking at Marana as a preferred destination. That is going to be the challenge, is to plan that growth. But I can certainly see it.
What advice would you give yourself for your unique and accomplished life, career, knowing what you know now?
Well, I would tell people, and I do this, I would tell them what I was told, and that is this: never lose sight of the fundamentals. For example, always set goals, establish priorities, build strategic relationships, develop good habits. Learn to identify bad habits and how to dissolve them early on so that they don't penalize you later with business failure, perhaps medical issues you could have avoided, maybe even a divorce. And the last thing is learn to value your time. It is the most precious commodity you have because how you use your time is a reflection of your values. And you never know who's watching, and you never know what impressions they are developing of you. And that's just based upon how they see you using your time. So never lose sight of the fundamentals.
What are some of the best resources that have helped you along your journey?
For me, it was people, the information they provided, the guidance, and that timely scholarship that made the difference between pursuing a dream and fulfilling a dream. And when you look at the kinds of information that's available today and the ease with which you can access information, it is one of the most valuable resources that's out there. You just have to be willing to take the time to look for it. And sometimes we don't.
George, we'll share in in the show notes your contact information, your LinkedIn, your website. What's your preferred communication style for anyone listening today that might not be reading the show notes at the moment, but will be later?
I'm a people person. Pick up the phone, call me, look at my website. If you have questions, call me. I'm available.
Is there anything else you'd want to share today, George?
Oh, we could go on, but I think those that are curious, read my memoir. That'll tell you a lot about me. If you have other questions, pick up the phone, call me. If you want to read my books, go to my website, georgealfredkennedy.com. And if that doesn't arouse your curiosity, it's been great talking to you.
George, I have quickly come to appreciate getting to know you and so grateful that you were on our podcast this morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being incredible. And thank you for being willing to share your story.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And it has been a delight getting to know you. And I look forward to our future cooperation in building this chamber.
Let's see where we go. The building's not built yet.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, George, again. And thank you to Anstar Production Group for recording this podcast. Have a great day.